Broadcasting live from Forward Observer Central Command in Austin, Texas. It's the man always out front on the issues. You're listening to Out Front with Samuel Culper.
Hello and good afternoon, and welcome to Out Front with Samuel Culper. I'm your host, Samuel Culper, and I'm coming to you live from Forward Observer Central Command here in Austin, Texas. So we've moved into this new office space here, and we put a TV up on the wall. Holy cow, sorry. Put a TV up on the wall. I've been watching MSNBC in anticipation of the Democratic National Convention that starts today. I'm actually looking forward to watching it and taking notes. I imagine I'll be talking about it quite a bit on this week's shows. So far this morning, they've been going crazy. There's a new MSNBC Wall Street Journal poll that shows that voters prefer Trump on the economy and crime. Oh yeah, so that honestly gives me quite a bit of hope for President Trump's re-election. As Bill Clinton, didn't Bill Clinton or somebody said? Oh, as James Carville said, it's the economy, stupid. So that's very hopeful seeing this. Also, Biden is polling at 50% or above in 4 recent major polls. This new CNN poll has Biden up by 4 points nationally. You cannot feel good about that if you're the Biden campaign. The CNN poll that says you're only up by 4 points nationally, that may be actually a Trump victory if that poll is at all accurate. And I'll tell you, another thing that I've been following is this kind of rift between what the Trump campaign should go after in terms of Kamala Harris. Because some pundits are saying that the Trump campaign should not be hammering Kamala Harris about anything, and they're wrong. Should Biden win, Harris is 12 minutes from becoming president. And if I were a Trump campaign strategist, I would be going after questions over Biden's mental health, and I would be asking who is going to really be running the administration, a Biden administration, due to Biden's senility. And if Biden steps aside in 3 or 6 or 12 months, if he does win, and he's out 3, 6, 12 months later because he just can't cut it, let's face it, Kamala Harris may as well be at the top of the ticket right now. If Biden doesn't make it for a full term, his full term, then you're basically voting for Kamala Harris. And that's just the reality of the situation. And Kamala Harris is 1,000% unelectable in the general election. She wasn't even electable in the Democratic primary. So how is she going to win the general election? She's not going to. And that's why I would make this campaign about her, at least as far as one potential strategy goes. Moving on, let's stay on the topic of politics. Last week I did one show, and it was only for like 10 or 15 minutes, so sorry about that. I went out of town. I said, look, I'll be able to do all this stuff, and nope, stuff started piling up. I got back on Wednesday, and then I took care of a bunch of problems that were piling up, but starting on Monday with a full week of shows this week. So at any rate, my time in Dallas, I had a great time. And if you're listening to this show and you're from the Dallas-Fort Worth area and you saw me talk about the importance of intelligence and some challenges, some huge challenges that this country has coming up, welcome. You have a great group up there in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And the more I've thought about the True Texas Project, and the more I've kind of looked at my own area here and kind of the local and regional areas as we move through this period of low-intensity conflict, we really have to have a local political effort. And I know that I was thinking about this recently. I know there's a tendency among the preparedness community to kind of like, okay, let's get our stuff and let's buy a bunch of firearms and food and water and all this stuff, and let's just kind of hunker down and wait this thing out. And I actually don't think that's the way to go. I think the real thing we ought to be doing is community organizing. And that's one thing I told the folks up in Dallas-Fort Worth is we have to be community organizing in these red counties, these Republican counties, to keep them And I'm not saying Republican. I'm not carrying the water for the GOP. I'm just saying we have to get good leaders. And we have to hang on politically to our areas. So if you're in the preparedness community and you think, I'm just going to hunker down and be active, be proactive. If you want to get out and do something, start building tribe or start building your local human terrain. I'm going to get a t-shirt that says terraform your local human terrain or something to that effect. And that's absolutely what we should be doing, is terraforming the local human terrain. Well, this weekend I spent reorganizing my garage and my home office, and I stumbled upon this box of books, and I opened it up, and they're all on guerrilla warfare. And I said, I remember stacking these books up when I was moving. Well, inside that box, on the very tip top, there was this book that I hold in my hands right now, a small red book, a vinyl cover, and I thought, what is this? I picked it up. Selected Military Writings of Mao Zedong. And it's a red book. It has a little gold star on there to let everyone know this is a communist book. Second pocket edition, 1972. Foreign language press, Peking, China. Printed in the People's Republic of China. It's a book in English that was intended to propagandize English audiences. Well, I started reading through it, and I came up to this. I think it's the second chapter of this book. In December 1929, that's when he wrote this particular essay. Mao Zedong, who is a Chinese communist revolutionary, wrote this essay addressing the problems that were detrimental to the success of the Red Army. And it is entitled, quote, "On Correcting Mistaken Ideas in the Party." And through this essay, Mao hoped to solve some of the problems that were plaguing the revolution. And I want to focus on the first section of this essay because, believe it or not, this holds quite a bit of truth for anti-communists in the United States, and really more specifically kind of patriots in the 21st century. So let's start from the top. So Mao starts off, he is correcting some of his Communist Party officers and their thinking. He writes, quote, they, quote, refuse to recognize that military affairs are only one means of accomplishing political tasks, end quote. They refuse to recognize that military affairs are only one means of accomplishing political tasks. In other words, to paraphrase Clausewitz, war is politics by other means. Throughout this chapter, Mao talks about his military leaders, and he says, you only focus on war fighting. Now, war fighting is important, but it is not the only thing that is important. War fighting or military affairs is only one means of accomplishing these political tasks. And so what does that mean for us on the anti-communist side, on the Patriot side? Well, my longtime criticism of the right, and specifically of Boogaloo groups or 3% groups, is the insistence that guns and ammo are the only recourse. I'm a huge proponent of soft power. And soft power on the right is completely, almost always completely overlooked. One thing that the left has been really good at is destroying conservative institutions, which were previously avenues for soft power. You look at the Boy Scouts, and you look at how many churches have been neutered. You look at what's happened to the NRA and some of these other organizations that have been infiltrated and neutered. And what that does is it starts to box in the right. This is one reason why all these far left activists want to kick Fox News off the air. And they say, oh, they produce disinformation and all. No, it's not because of that. It's because it's a media arm for conservative thinking, and they don't like it and they want it gone. Because Fox News, love them or hate them or agree or disagree with them, it doesn't matter. They are an avenue for soft power for the right in general. And Mao wants you to know that if you don't develop soft power, if you do not have the ability to influence people at scale, then you are making the same mistakes that his Communist Party did. All these threeper groups and the militias and all this stuff. And they're going out and playing Rambo in the woods. Okay, that's all fine and good. But how many armed engagements have they been in versus the number of unarmed engagements where they have had the ability to influence people at scale, the ability to mass influence people? Probably a lot more than the number of firefights they've been in here in the United States so far. Moving on, the next quote I want to talk about. Mao writes, quote, they, talking about these military and party officers, they think that the task of the Red Army is merely to fight. They do not understand that the Chinese Red Army is an armed body for carrying out the political tasks of the revolution. So Mao, again, here is pointing out that war fighting is only one avenue. And Mao continues and he says that the Red Army must, quote, shoulder such important tasks as doing propaganda among the masses, organizing the masses, arming them, and helping them to establish revolutionary political power. End quote. Mao wants you to know, if you're looking at guns and ammo as your only recourse, then you are not informing and influencing. You are not community organizing for political power or to stop socialists and socialist political power from arising. You know, chances are good if your county has a college, there's actually a pretty darn good chance, in most cases, that you have some, it may be very small, but you may have some very small socialist element there. Like a Youth Democratic Socialists of America, you may have some outright communists there, either in the core of professors or amongst the student body. And you know what that allows us to do? When the socialists are in such a small minority, that really allows us an opportunity to community organize and to isolate them and to make them into social pariahs. Okay, just like the left does on these major campuses to conservative professors or to members of, campus Republicans or whatever, right? They isolate them and, they follow all the rules for Alinsky there. And in our counties, or maybe in some of our cities or towns that are very conservative, we have the ability to search out, to find these people who are trying to build a socialist political movement and turn them into social pariahs, to isolate them just like the left does to conservatives. And if we aren't doing that, then we are allowing these socialists to gain a foothold in our local politics. And that's, as they say, problematic. Moving on, Mao warns that army officials who are concerned only with war fighting and not conducting propaganda and organizing and arming the masses risk, quote, estrangement from the masses, end quote. And he talks about the white army, which we'll get to in just a second, the nationalist, anti-communist army. And he alludes to some of the things that they're doing. And he's basically saying, look, this anti-communist white army, they're not organizing the masses. They're not arming the masses. They're trying to fight this war by themselves. They're approaching this as from purely a militaristic warfighting view. And he says that is wrong, at least for the communists. He says, look, we have to have a mass people, a mass movement. And we do have to organize and arm the masses. And so when he says, when you're only focused on warfighting, i.e. when you're only focused on kitting up and putting on your camouflage, whatever, and going out and running in the woods and sleeping in the woods overnight or whatever in some 24-hour or 48-hour FTX thing with some militia, not your militia, but with these militia guys, they're not risking estrangement from the masses. They are estranging themselves from the masses. So I'm not saying stop doing that, but you got to put on some khaki pants and a button-up shirt and go meet people and go do community service. You look at what these far left groups are doing, even the communist ones. They're running soup kitchens, and they're running what do they call them? Brake light. What do they call them? Like these little things, if you have a brake light out, you can pull in, they test your brake light so you don't get pulled over. And, if your brake light or turn signal or whatever's out, they'll just, pop the hood or open up the trunk or whatever and change that light bulb out for you. And then they're doing like actual community service. They are organizing. If they're not organizing the masses, they're at least building some level of popular support. Because here's the thing, right? When it does come time, and it's just my key assumption that eventually all of these leftists who are arming because they do expect at some point some armed conflict to happen. Well, when that armed conflict does happen, all of a sudden all these people that say, oh, I remember they fed me at the soup kitchen. Or, hey, these people, they changed my brake light. Or, I remember these guys, they were doing some community service, some kind of charity or humanitarian work. They're good people. I'm going to support them. And if these militia folks and these 3%ers aren't doing that kind of stuff, they do risk estrangement from the masses. And that includes in urban areas or in rural areas. Mao then warns that these Red Army officials and party officials who only focus on warfighting, they overlook the importance of, Mao says, of propaganda teams. And he says they overlook the importance of organizing local workers and peasants to aid in the war effort. And the more you understand about this three-part insurgency model, this Maoist insurgency model, the more this is going to make sense. I did a YouTube video of that last year. I'll probably circle around and do some other podcast version of that. Mao writes, quote, military officers, quote, do not realize that it is an important task of the Red Army to arm the local masses. This is the small group mentality in a magnified form, end quote. This small group mentality he's talking about is he's talking about the white army. They're a small army. They're a small group of warfighters. They're not involving the masses. And Mao is saying you have to excise this small group mentality from yourselves. Have a big group mentality, a collective mentality. Organize and arm the workers and the peasants. It takes everybody. And once we have everybody pushing in the same direction, we can win a lot more conflicts just through sheer volume, if not through superior military tactics. Directly after this, Mao explains that military officers who are unable to see beyond the army, he says, quote, they believe that no other revolutionary forces exist, end quote. Basically what he's saying is that Red Army officers who aren't going out, who aren't sending Red Army members out into these villages and out into these rural areas to meet with workers and peasants, if you're not doing that, you're not making contact with people who may support your Red Army goals. He says you may, if you're only focused on warfighting, you believe that no other revolutionary forces exist. And Mao's saying, go out among the populace. By the way, sorry for the audio. It's going to be like this for several days until we can get a little podcasting booth built in here, but we're working on it. Mao says, go out into the populace. Go and meet these people. Go meet the workers and the peasants who are going to support our revolutionary aims, who will support us through being an auxiliary, support us through providing us with food or with supplies or a place to sleep or with political power. Go out and meet these people. Go develop the populace. Go terraform your human terrain. Mao says you have to do this. And not that I'm promoting a communist-style approach to organizing patriots, but look, if a man's right, he's right. And Mao is right about this. Mao is absolutely right about this. You know, they talk about a whole of government approach or a whole of society approach to tackling COVID or tackling racism or tackling whatever, right? Let's build a whole of society approach to defending liberty, to defending the Second Amendment, to defending the Bill of Rights. Let's have a whole of society approach. Don't break out of this small group mentality. And I'm not trying to pick on the militias. It's just a lot of these militias are just an easy target. They have a small group mentality. They say, well, we're in the militia and you're not. Well, that's a problem. Because, hate to break it to you, but your militia is not the majority of the people. You're a very tiny minority of the people who surround you. And if you estrange yourself from the masses, you're very likely to end up on the losing side of a conflict. So break out of the small group mentality. Don't estrange yourself from the masses. Go out and meet these people and get to know them and do humanitarian work or do charity work and work on building a community, work on building the tribe. Especially those of you who are out in very rural, very Republican/conservative areas. I mean, that's just an easy win. That's just an easy win. You're not going to have anyone running you off because you're trying to get their support in supporting conservative causes. Here's something interesting. Mao continues. He says that officers who are only concerned with warfighting, quote, do not take pains to do minute and detailed work among the masses, but riddled with illusions want to do only big things, end quote. And this comes back to another common complaint or common criticism. It's not a complaint, but it's a criticism that I have among certain parts of the right, is that you focus on like, oh, fighting the Civil War II and, going sea to shining sea and doing all this stuff. You are riddled with illusions. You only want to do these big things, Mao says. Mao says what you're not doing is taking pains to do minute and detailed work among the masses. In effect, you're not putting in work locally. You're daydreaming about fighting some big Civil War II. So we got to put in the work locally if we're going to save our way of life, if we're going to save liberty, if we're going to achieve liberty in our lifetimes. If not, we're just going to throw it on some other generation. Mao then goes on to say that this mindset where we only focus on warfighting, that kind of mindset causes, quote, overconfidence in the military strength and absence of confidence in the strength of the masses of the people. Now this is, end quote. Now this is getting a little collectivy. Okay, I get it. Right, this is forced collectivization that Mao's basically talking about, using the masses of the people. But I only say that, I'm not encouraging necessarily like collectivism like Mao's talking about here. But Mao's talking about getting lots of people who can pitch in their own ways. And they're not warfighters, they're not gunslingers, but they can support an effort in other ways. And basically Mao's saying, if you do not get these people on board, you're not going to be bigger and better than the white army. You're not going to be bigger and better than the anti-communist army. And Mao repeatedly talks about the differences between the Red Army and the White Army, which is this Chinese nationalist army. From the context of reading this essay, Mao is explaining that the Red Army relies on the active support from the populace as a result of propaganda efforts and mass organizing. He says that the Red Army is the army of the people And the white army is purely a warfighting army, and there's a very large and very clear distinction between soldier and civilian in the white army. You're a soldier or you are a civilian. In Mao's red army, you were an army of the people. Everyone was a soldier, if necessary. And later in this essay, this is actually maybe the most important, or most intriguing part of this essay. And I had to read a little bit of history to really understand this context. It's kind of a headache, but Mao he talks about these, quote, roving rebel bands. And these rebel bands are they're communist guerrilla fighters. They're out in these areas that conduct raids on these towns. And he says that they're uninterested, or Mao writes rather, they're uninterested in increasing political power through anything other than guerrilla action. And Mao admonishes these people, and he writes, quote, these guerrilla bands, these guerrilla fighters, quote, are unwilling to increase political power by undertaking the arduous task of building up base areas and establishing the people's political power. End quote. And Mao says, look, this is actually pretty crazy. He goes on, he says, eradication is an important objective of these roving rebel bands. He says, I want these rogue guerrilla elements, I want them eradicated. And he says, we cannot permit ununified guerrilla action because it's not contributing to the strategy. You're not building popular support through these random guerrilla actions. You're not building an army of the people. He basically calls it putschism. These people are trying to foment a putsch. So I guess all this is to say, look, you want to take action? Go build your tribe locally. Start at your church. Start at your local gun stores. Start somewhere. Organize your community against the socialists or against the communists or their political efforts or their protests or riots. And I don't mean to make this a workers' or a people's movement, but Mao was obviously onto something when he talked about building popular support and the crucial role that the populace plays in conflict, especially irregular conflict. You know, one of the biggest things that Napoleon was credited with doing? For the first time in human history, he unified the people, the government, and the military. And that's one of the things that made him such an effective military leader. He unified all three of those national powers. Mao here is organizing civilian power towards revolutionary ends. That's exactly what's happening in this country right now. And I would say for right now, if you want to take action, build your tribe, organize your community. In several of the essays I read on Saturday night, I just started reading. I wanted to blow my brains out halfway through this thing. Mao is admonishing parts of the Red Army. He's criticizing them, especially those guerrilla factions, because they were carrying out raids against these cities and against these nationalist targets. And he's basically saying, look, this is military action that doesn't result in any strategic success. He says, look, if you want to build revolutionary power, you have to organize and arm the masses, not carry out these random and sporadic guerrilla attacks. Basically, these guerrilla attacks are not winning the revolution. The organized masses will win the revolution. And so I look at these random, these rallies and stuff that are going on, and I don't know, maybe that's organizing the masses. I think more than anything, it's just creating a spectacle, or maybe creating a potential flashpoint where people can get into fistfights or something, or law enforcement has to come out. And I'm not saying that's, there's probably some propaganda value in that, seeing leftists attacking these peaceful marches. Unfortunately, in the media, well, we know how most of the media is going to characterize that. But if you want to go do something, start knocking on doors, start a neighborhood watch, organize locally. One last point. I know I just hit 30 minutes, but let me make this one last point. there's an essay, the essay directly after the one I just talked about. It was written in January 1930, just 1 month after that last essay. It's entitled, "A Single Spark Can Start a Prairie Fire." And Mao explains this general strategy of Maoist revolution. It starts with establishing base areas of popular support. Then you systematically build up political power. He's describing the communist revolution in China. You establish these base areas. You build popular support. You systematically build up your political power in these areas. You expand the People's Revolution through recruiting Red Guards at the town level. These Red Guards are basically the local peasant militia, effectively. And then you start building up the district Red Guards. And then you build up the Red Guards at the county level. And then you build up your Red Army troops after that. And then you spread revolutionary political power by advancing in waves with mass revolutionary military and political power. Mao writes, quote, "Only thus is it possible to build the confidence of the revolutionary masses throughout the country. Only thus is it possible to create tremendous difficulties for the reactionary ruling classes, shake their foundation, and hasten their internal disintegration." And Mao spells this all out. It starts with establishing base areas. And you look at the country, and it's very easy to identify those base areas. They have set up political power. They're expanding the People's Revolution. There were literally some groups who called themselves Red Guards. They were armed revolutionary communists. I'd say the Red Guards of today is more like the anti-fascist movement, the Marxist tendencies of Black Lives, or the BLM movement. And what's next? Then start building your district Red Guards, and then your county Red Guards, and then your local Red Army. And then you spread revolutionary political power in waves. Now, I'm not saying necessarily that this is exactly what's going to happen next. I'm just saying that what we've seen so far in the past several years has been right out of this essay called "A Single Spark Can Start a Prairie Fire." As a matter of fact, there are some bookstores and groups and stuff that call themselves Prairie Fire. And once you read more about Mao, you know exactly what they're referring to now. I'm not saying that we're going to get to having a Red Army in this country, but it certainly looks like they're on that path right now. By the way, Max and I are about to record the early warning podcast today. If you're not signed up, head over to forwardobserver.com/subscribe, and you can get access to our daily intelligence reporting. You can really get in the weeds of exactly what's happening, and you can also listen to the podcast version where we typically talk about things in a little bit greater detail. Well, thanks for listening to this podcast. If you're listening on Apple or Google or wherever on the podcast version, if you think I deserve it, please give this show a 5-star rating and review. That would help me out quite a bit, help us reach more people, help us rise in these search results. And I certainly would appreciate that. Well, I'll be back on the show, broadcast live at forwardobserver.fm tomorrow afternoon at 2 p.m. Central, or I'll catch you on the podcast version after that. Thanks for listening. Until then, be well and stay out front.